this video lecture, I'm going to talk about interviewing, and I'll review 3 different types of interviews that we use in political science. And we'll see that interviewing can take the form of either quantitative data or can produce qualitative data that we can analyze. So we'll look through these different forms of interviewing and assess the advantages and disadvantages of each. To talk through what interviewing looks like, let's think through an example of a researcher who wants to study Indigenous mobilization in Mexico. And this researcher has an idea about how religious participation, membership in churches, and how frequently an Indigenous member of a community is participating in formalized religion, that might affect their interest in mobilizing and the degree to which they mobilize. So there are a lot of different ways that you could investigate this idea, that there's a relationship between the church and mobilization, which might involve you wanting to actually talk to people who are Indigenous to see what their behavior has been. So let's talk through some of these. The first type is that you might want to do a survey. And this we would think of as interviewing. It's a structured form of interviewing. So you, in a survey, you're talking to people and asking predetermined questions, and you're asking several of these questions of many respondents. So you'll be able to take out, say, 20 minutes of their time, maybe 30 minutes, and you're asking quite a number of questions in those 20, perhaps 30 minutes. And you'll want to get these answers from lots of different respondents. So your questions can take one of 2 forms. First, they could be closed-ended questions, in which you would provide a list of responses from which the respondents will be choosing. So for this example of Indigenous mobilization, you might ask questions such as, are you Indigenous? What language do you speak in your home? Things that have a simple yes-no answer, or they have a simple response that they can say that they speak this dialect of the Mayan language. You might take more complex questions such as, what is your feeling thermometer towards the current government? Or why did you decide that you wanted to mobilize, and give them a set of predetermined responses. So if you say, why did you want to mobilize? You would say, to advance your economic situation. Perhaps you would say, because you have an obligation for your community. You would give them predetermined answers, and they would simply pick the one that fits them best. And those would be closed-ended questions. Or you might ask them open-ended questions where you don't provide a list of responses from which the respondent will choose, but the responses are typically short. So you might say, why did you mobilize? And then expect them to give a 1 to 2 sentence response. Maybe they talk for a couple of minutes, but it's still fairly limited because, again, you only have 20 to 30 minutes. And here you want to be gathering as much information as you possibly can in something that can be, in the end, quantified when it's entered into the survey, into the data set from the survey. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of doing surveys? So in terms of the advantages, we see that it produces a lot of data set observations, that everyone produces their response, and they say, I have a feeling thermometer of 50 for the current administration. I participate this many times a month. They're able to produce a lot of responses on all these different variables. And then you have a lot of different number of people that you have surveyed. That means you're able to discern broad trends and make overall generalizations. You can say most people are participating because of this reason. Or you can say that 20% of people have a connection with the Catholic Church. So you can make these sorts of generalizations that you would then be able to say are representative of the overall population that you want to be talking about. But in terms of limitations, there are several limitations for surveys. So first of all, the researcher may overlook some important causal processes. They may have decided in advance that this relationship with the church is what matters, and that you want to also look at relationships with political parties, but you have predetermined hypotheses. And so those are the questions that you're going to ask. This is a pretty limited set of questions, and is really determined in advance by the researcher. So there could be something that's really important that's going on that the researcher just didn't include in the survey and therefore gets overlooked. or you might have weak conceptual validity. And that means you might have a very complex concept that's involved, such as connection with the Catholic Church, that you might try to be capturing by saying, how frequently do you go to church? But maybe somebody's religious identity isn't simply encapsulated by how frequently they go to church. Maybe their connection with the church is more spiritual than that, is more in terms of how education in a Catholic school has shaped the way they view the world. If you just ask people pointed survey questions, you may not be able to get at that potential impact. And so the concept of how somebody who's Indigenous is tied to the Catholic Church might really not be captured by the questions that you're asking. So this is the survey model, and we can look at more qualitative forms of data collection. The first type of this would be semi-structured interviewing, and this is the most common form of qualitative interviewing that we do in political science. So with semi-structured interviewing, we ask fewer predetermined questions of fewer respondents. So maybe in a survey, you're surveying 2,000 people. With the semi-structured interviewing, you're interviewing, say, 100, maybe 200 people. And you don't have as many questions, whereas with the survey, you had 20 minutes of people's time, and so you went through a lot of simplified questions, and you wanted to go through and get as much information as possible in terms of the number of questions. So maybe you had 30 questions that you asked. With semi-structured interviewing, you don't want to ask 30 questions. You want to ask, say, 6 questions in order to get a lot more information. But the semi-structured nature of it, the structured part, is that you do come in with a general sense of what those 6 questions might be, but the responses are open-ended and they're longer than with surveys. So you might ask people, you might ask every respondent, what is your relationship with the Catholic Church? And then you allow them to interpret that question and give a response as they like. And that response might be an answer that is 10 minutes, 15 minutes. They'll decide what it means to have a relationship with the Catholic Church, and they'll give you a longer, more complex response than they would with a survey question of how frequently do you attend Mass. One of the important advantages of this mode of semi-structured interviewing is that it allows you to, as a researcher, to ask follow-up questions. So somebody talks about the potential or the past influence of having had this religious education. You can say, oh, that's really interesting. Is that something that most members of this community have experienced as well? Or you can ask, well, can you tell me a specific example of how this tie with the Catholic Church has shaped your view? With a survey, there's predetermined questions. You're filling out a questionnaire, and you don't have room to be asking these kinds of probing follow-up questions. And often you can get at the idea a lot deeper if you ask these follow-up questions in what's more of a conversation. And then finally, sometimes you have different kinds of questions for different kinds of respondents. So with a semi-structured nature, there is some degree of structure where you do come in with predetermined questions that are shaped by hypotheses that you have. But you might ask different kinds of questions of, say, this Indigenous woman here who is a member of a movement, and then maybe you want to be talking to people in the Catholic Church. So you'd have different questions about the relationship with these movements that you would ask of a priest or you would ask of a bishop. And this enables you to get at different sides of that causal process from different sorts of actors. If you did a survey, you would be asking all the same kinds of people. You would be asking people who are participants in these movements, and you'd be surveying them. So with the semi-structured interviewing, you can relax that need to have everything be uniform and really tailor your questions to the kinds of people that you want to be asking questions of. Thinking about the advantages and disadvantages of semi-structured interviewing, in terms of the advantages, we're able to look at causal process observations and then analyze this causal chain at a close range. So the focus here isn't on producing these data set observations where you're able to make broad generalizations. Instead, you can ask leaders of the movement, what is your relationship with the church? How did that shape your activities? you can ask the church, what is your relationship with Indigenous movements? And you can test out what your different hypotheses about what this relationship might actually look at. You can look at close range from the people who are really directly involved in it. And this can also enable you to have stronger conceptual validity than you might have with a survey. So thinking about that example, once again, about the way that people view their connection with the Catholic Church and how that shapes their mobilization, you're able to probe what that really means and all the different ways that people might be connected with the church. So you're allowed to explore some of these complex identities and causes with greater nuance than you might be able to do with a survey. And finally, this is useful for both hypothesis testing and hypothesis generation. Hypothesis testing, because you come in with some hypotheses that you want to ask people about to get this information about these causal process observations. But also, there's hypothesis generation, and that's because you may not know exactly how the causal process works, or there may be different hypotheses that you never thought of until you started talking to people who are directly involved. And from my own experience, this is a major part of the interview process, because you may think that you understand the dynamics, but until you actually ask people questions, you may not have a clear sense of what's really going on the ground. There are, of course, limitations. First, namely that the findings may not be generalizable. Even if you collect, say, 150 or 200 interviews, you're not actually necessarily having 200 interviews of all the same kinds of people. So in my research for my book, I have 150 interviews, but some of those people are politicians, some of those people are civil society activists, some are bureaucrats, some of them are academics who are influential in the processes that I study, and so I don't actually have a large enough N that I'm able to study everyone. And even if I did, I wouldn't necessarily be able to say that the respondents for my interviews are representative of a larger population. So I can't say that these are generalizable results based on what these individuals told me, but the individuals were at the heart of the process, and therefore what they say is really important for testing hypotheses. And then the final form would be considered unstructured interviewing. So this in some ways is sort of similar to semi-structured, but is much looser. So here, this is when you're in an exploratory stage of a research project, and you ask these exploratory questions of fewer respondents, again, fewer compared to in surveys. And so you might just go into a community and start asking people, how did you get involved in this movement? Why did you decide to participate? You might just ask questions that you don't have a predetermined agenda in advance about what you should be asking. You're just trying to probe a little bit, figure out what's going on, explore what's going on in order to figure out what your hypotheses eventually will be. So these responses are open-ended and key that they're not really determined in advance, and they're not linked to a pre-existing hypothesis. This often goes with participant observation, where you're embedded in a community and you're observing what's going on. And these questions, again, like with semi-structured, they leave room for follow-up questions, and you have different types of questions for different types of respondents. So we see that there are a lot of similarities with semi-structured interviewing. The key difference is that structured part, that the researcher has hypotheses that she wants to test and has predetermined questions with semi-structured interviewing. With unstructured interviewing, you're just going in and trying to figure out what's going on. So I'm thinking about the advantages and disadvantages. In terms of advantages, well, this is really great for hypothesis generating. That's the purpose of it. But in terms of limitations, there are definitely some limitations, namely that you're unable to test hypotheses. So in practice, you often will start with more unstructured interviewing and then move towards semi-structured interviewing as you develop the hypotheses that come from these initial interviews, so that you're able to move to a place where you are able to test hypotheses.